Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future.
Welcome to another week of Shaken Not Burned. Our economic system is based on extracting as much value as possible from natural resources without taking into consideration the principles and processes that power our ecosystems. Humans are disrupting the natural world because we have somehow convinced ourselves that we are not part of it. But really we are and couldn't survive without it. If we focused on regeneration rather than extraction, we could create a new balance where human activities are finally integrated with nature, protecting and serving ecosystems rather than exploiting them. That's where the concept of a regenerative economy comes in. We cover it in today's interview with Erinch Sahan, Business and Enterprise Lead at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, or DEAL for short. Thank you so much for joining us today, Erinch.
Wonderful to join you, Julia.
So why don't we start off with maybe you telling us a bit about your experience, and then we can move on about the concept of regenerative and what it means.
Great. Well, I mean, I've had quite a winding journey. I started out firstly in corporate law. I studied law and business. Ended up being much more interested in what my clients were doing. Moved over to the business side. Worked at Procter and Gamble for a while, and then after a few years, I realized actually I have a different curiosity, a different passion, and I ended up volunteering in Africa, in West Africa, in a refugee camp, helping set up microfinance initiatives and doing some teaching before moving into that career of poverty alleviation and international development. So the substance of my career has been in that world. I worked in Indonesia, I worked in Kenya, I've worked in Thailand, in Myanmar, and across Southeast Asia more broadly, before moving on to be the CEO of the World Fair Trade Organization. And fair trade was where a lot of my skills came together. How do we use trade to address poverty, eliminate poverty, empower people, promote sustainability, and more recently, I moved to Doughnut Economics Action Lab to lead the work on applying this concept of regenerative and ecological economics to the world of business. I've got a few other things on the side that I do. I sit on a few boards. I'm on the board of Finance Innovation Lab, so I'm focused a lot on how do we redesign, restructure financial systems to enable this transformation to happen. I'm on the board of the Social Enterprise World Forum as well, which is very much about promoting the global social enterprise movement. And lastly, I do some teaching at Cambridge, at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership on sustainable value chains. So I've got a lot of students from the business world, mid-career professionals who are wanting to upskill in sustainability. And I have to say, I learn more from them than they learn from me.
I'm sure it's also the other way around. I mean, what an experience. I'm actually really interested in learning about how the concept of regenerative business can also help poverty alleviation. So maybe if you could provide the definition of regenerative, and then I love that you have a donut mug.
I do. It was a present from a friend, and I'll use it as a prop later to explain the donut itself.
Amazing. Oh, perfect. Yeah. So please let's talk about regeneration and how we can put the concept of making having people and work and nature work together as part of one system.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of definitions of regenerative that are going around, and lots of valid ways of understanding it. The way that we've been engaging with it in the Doughnut economics community is very much drawing on the fact that we need to live with and within the cycles of the living world. So it's about going beyond doing no harm. It's not about, how do we reduce deforestation, but how do we restore landscapes? It's not about How do we reduce carbon footprints? But how do we sequester carbon, so absorb carbon back in the same way nature would? And a lot of the wisdom actually comes from the concepts of biomimicry, which is about how do we take the wisdom and the genius of nature, the balance that nature has, that there is no waste in nature. The output of one thing is the input to another. You can't find, a rubbish dump in nature. Everything is useful to something else. It's us as humans who have created materials that don't decompose, that extract nutrients but don't give anything back into the cycle of the living world. So a lot of it being regenerative is about looking back to nature and say we're a part of nature. We depend on it. We're another animal. We have to live within the cycles of this amazing living world. And I'm not sure if you'd be following, like, people are interested in going to Mars and these other planets. These other planets are terrible. Earth is amazing. You have to work so hard to get make a bit of water and to grow something very small. We have all the wonderful balance and the richness of this planet to be, inducive to human and all life and to live in balance with each other. So being regenerative is about recognizing that is the actual home. That's our home that we live in. And how do we live within the cycles of that living world? And there's a whole host of things as circularity comes into it. So how do we make sure that every material is either a synthetic or a technical material, right? It's either a synthetic or a natural material. So the natural materials can go back into earth. So the shirt I'm wearing, if it's a fiber, if it's a cotton fiber, it can go back into nature. It can decompose and go back into the living world. But if it's synthetic fiber, then that's okay. But then we need to design it so that it can go into its own recycling, reusing, restoring loop. And that concept of creating loops of different materials, for natural materials to go back into nature, to be separated from other kinds of materials, and the synthetic technical materials to be reused, restored, like modular products such as Fairphone, for instance, or the laptop I'm using right now, the Framework laptop. These are modular, so the parts can be upgraded, reused, restored, etc., repaired. Those are the concepts to build into a regenerative economy. And of course, I've only touched on the ecological side here, Julia. There is probably a social side we can touch on, but to begin with, it's about recognizing that we are a part of the living world, and all our economic activity has to be designed to fit within the cycles of that living world.
When you mentioned the phone and the laptop, it made me think of the concept of planned obsolescence, which is when products are built not to last, they're built to then be replaced quickly because it's more profitable. So it sounds like regeneration looks at that, keeping the concept, like keeping materials in circulation as much as possible, which is also the concept of circularity. So what is the difference really? Like, is circularity part of regeneration, and where does Doughnut Economics also stand in this whole universe of alternative economic models?
Absolutely. I mean, circularity is a central part of regeneration. Circularity is about recognizing the flows of materials, but also, as well as the flow of energy, because we also want to minimize the loss or the waste of energy as well. That the output of one thing is an input to another. I've seen factories where the heat produced from a manufacturing process gets stored in a different part of the factory for use as energy in a different form. So energy can have its loop as well as materials. So circularity is central to this. I think we would add into circularity that concept of biomimicry, which I mentioned briefly. The amazing researcher scientist Janine Benyus came up with this modern version of this concept, most recent version, and I think one question encapsulates for me what biomimicry means in this context, which is, if this building that we are in right now, whichever, and I'm talking to all the listeners out there, whichever building you're in, whichever building you see around you, if that building wasn't there, what would there be there instead? Now, probably there will be wildland. So that wildland might be wetland, it might be a forest, it might be a savanna, but it would be some kind of wildland. And that wildland would be sequestering carbon. It would be cleaning the groundwater. As the groundwater goes through, it'll get cleaner. It will be cleaning the air. It would be providing shade on hot summer days for species, for mammals. It will be putting nutrients back into the soil so that it's giving, it's being beneficial. It's being positive in its contributions. It's deliberately creating positive impacts. That's what nature does. So if you take humans out, the natural ecosystem actually creates benefits, and we can mimic some of that. We can have factories that behave like a forest. We can have a factory that is not just saying, well, let's have less harm. Let's reduce the carbon footprint. Let's reduce the energy use. Let's reduce the water use. Let's make the water that we extract and then dispose of a little bit less dirty or a little bit less polluted. Well, that's not regeneration. That's a different thing. Regeneration would be saying, okay, well, how do we do what nature does? Nature would, the water that leaves our factory is cleaner than the water that came in. That's what nature would have done. That we would be sequestering carbon. So we'll be storing it, not just reducing the amount we emit. It's those sorts of questions that are at the heart of bringing regenerative thinking into business and economics. And it feels like a leap because it is. And there was this period of late 20th century economics where we just accelerated the damage, and the early 21st century, of course, as well, that we've done to nature and living systems and the natural world. And that has to be a temporary blip. We cannot, that's not something that has to be this little exceptional period of human history where we did that kind of ramping up of damage, and we went back into living with and within the cycles of the living world.
Yeah, this makes me think of the concept of Earth Overshoot Day, which is when it's that day in the year when we have used all Earth's available resources. Correct. So the first, I went and did some research on it because I thought it was really interesting that the first time that it was recorded was Christmas Day in 1974. So that means that year we consumed all of the resources available just 6 days before the end of the year. And last year in 2024, it was on 1st of August. So it's possible that this year we could see it as early as July. So we are, using these resources at an alarmingly fast rate. What's going to happen when Earth Overshoot Day is on 2nd of January?
Well, I mean, I think we have to figure out a way of avoiding that, because the damage that can be done through that through the direction we're going is so complex, is so significant, so intensive that we actually can't know all of the consequences. That's the scary bit, is that we are going to make it incredibly difficult to have any form of stable human civilization on this planet unless we redesign. And it's inevitable anyway, right? So the way that we are consuming, we are producing, the way we're using energy, we could keep going, we could stretch it out for another couple of decades. But then we have to change anyway. Nature is going to force us to change because of the kind of damage and imbalance we're creating. And it's just much better for everyone if we plan for that. We go, look, this is coming down the line. Like, if you know that there is a disruption that's going to happen that you can avoid, why wouldn't you plan for it? Because it's going to come anyway. You're going to need to have a different kind of business model, different kind of approach to your product design, to your engagement with customers, with manufacturing processes, services, whatever it is. You're going to need to redesign this because the disruption is going to be so heavy. So why not do that in a planned, controlled way rather than wait for things to get out of hand and out of control?
Yeah, absolutely. So this way, this planned way that will happen to redesign our economic system, who do you think should lead it? Because when I'm thinking of, the concept, the examples that you provided about regenerative business, so far it sounds to me like something that an individual company would say, okay, let's do this because we are, we want to go further than no harm. But can it be enacted at a more systemic level?
I think so. I mean, my experience with this, and I've been struggling with this question, Julia, for about 20 years.
Okay.
Who should do it? And I've worked on it from different angles. So I've said, I know it should be government. So I worked in government, tried to bring some things. Okay, no, that's not quite enough. Okay, it should be companies. So let's partner with companies, see if companies can see the win-win business case. Well, actually, that wasn't quite enough. Consumer pressure. So I went and I worked on creating this big consumer campaign on food companies called Behind the Brands, and we drove some change, and that wasn't quite sufficient. I went to investors, and well, maybe it's through investor pressure that we're going to need to do this. And then went back to sort of individuals. Oh, maybe it's enlightened leadership, like enlightened CEOs and C-suite executives and business owners that can drive this. Or it's new entrepreneurs, or it's students. Like there are so many civil society organizations, trade unions. There are so many ways this pressure can come. My honest conclusion is it's all of it, and all of it is looking at each other as well for courage and for a sense that this is the direction. Like I'm talking to government policymakers who are looking at businesses are going, you want us to do this, right? Like this is good for the economy as well. And the businesses are going to investors going, well, wait a minute, you're okay if this disrupts our short to medium term returns for a bit because we're making a transition to something that's more sustainable. And then investors looking back to the government go, well, you should regulate this actually. And sort of everyone's sort of watching each other, and consumers are looking going, is anyone going to do this? I'm not sure. Like how. So I think the answer is that all of it. And I think it's going to be a messy process of getting to a tipping point. And once we get to a tipping point, then it starts to accelerate. So change happens really slow until it happens fast, and we're in that bit where change is happening slow. So it feels like it might not happen. It feels like it might be too late to happen. But also there are so many amazing initiatives and individuals that are pushing ahead and are pushing us towards a tipping point where this stuff is going to feel more viable, more desirable, and more inevitable.
How will the tipping point look like?
I wish I knew that answer, but I think I know. I have a hunch for some bits of that answer from what I've seen. I think part of it's going to be quite ambitious and courageous business leaders, which is why this is where I've been working with my career the last, over 12, 14 years is focusing on how do we change business leadership in this and how do we create the innovations necessary. So I think part of it's going to be people sticking their neck out and being the first mover or taking the risk, absorbing the hits at the beginning. And there are some companies demonstrating this. And I think on the back of that, we're going to see governments courageous enough to do it. Because currently, when a government wants to regulate strongly, there are people shouting, saying this is bad for the economy, this is bad for jobs, this is bad for investment, this is bad for, business environment more broadly. And those are often the lowest common denominator voices. So people that are just against change. And the more we have individuals saying, no, we want this, we want a level playing field. The companies doing more need government to step out to support them, not create an uneven playing field where they're at a disadvantage often with a lot of the behaviors we're talking about. So, yeah, I think there's going to be a connection of, I think, investors coming in saying, we see this is the future. These are the companies of the future. We're not going to assess this on 2-year, 5-year time horizons. This is 20-year, 30-year time horizon. In 30 years' time, if we haven't transitioned to this kind of economy, everything is doomed anyway. We've lost it.
There's nothing to invest in. Yeah.
So you have two scenarios. Either we made the transition, and if we made the transition, great. You picked the winners quickly. You were part of that journey quick at the beginning. If we're not going to make the transition, we're burning your money anyway. Like the financial system collapses, lots of things don't work. So either way, I think there is a tipping point at which investors see that, and then companies see that they can respond, and governments see that this is the direction they need to move. So I think those three forces can feed each other to get to that tipping point.
Okay. So it still sounds like it's ever so slightly investor-led, because in the end of the day, they are the ones with the money. Do you think that they are at this point yet? Are they recognizing the value of a transition yet? Because there are a lot of companies rowing back on their sustainability commitments. And I mean, these are the big names. So obviously they're the ones that make the news. There are loads of companies that are also walking the walk. But then at the same time, the EU, which is for me the jurisdiction which is sort of leading the pack in terms of sustainability regulation, is also watering down the final version of those regulations. So sometimes it's like we were doing so well and now we're taking so many steps back. And is anyone there like really conscious and like someone powerful with the realization that, yeah, we need to act now?
I mean, it's a great question. I'm not sure it's going to be led by investors, by the way.
Okay.
I think it's going to be a bit of a mix. I think investors are being led by the pioneering business leaders who are being led by civil society and activists who are pushing people and pioneering and creating social enterprises, and then some government leaders creating something like a small sort of part of the economy where people can experiment and push these things forward. So I think it's a bit of a triangulation going on where people are finding a little bit of courage from each other.
Mm-hmm.
But I also see what you see as well, that we're living in a time where economic security is a central focus of policymaking. There is a real concern for, the international trading order, the international financial system, and people not wanting to take risks in policymaking and government roles. I do see that as well. But it's a bit like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Net, it is still 1 step forward, even with the watered down regulations. And I think the most important thing is that we don't over celebrate and we don't over emphasize the value of those small steps, because they're not, they're hard won, but they're not the destination. We're still shaking a system that is stubbornly sitting, I think, at a central point, which is that we can only do sustainability or be regenerative if it demonstrates maximum returns to capital. That is the central design of business, finance, and to an extent, the international financial and trading order. And that is a straitjacket that we've put on everything, that we can only save ourselves if we demonstrate that each of the steps needed are maximum returns to capital. And that is an unlikely scenario where all of the steps needed are all going to yield the maximum returns to capital. Like, that is unlikely in the short term anyway.
Mm-hmm.
In the long term, there's an economic and systemic risk, which is a different thing altogether. But businesses aren't set up to consider that. They're set up to consider narrow, short term, but even long term narrow perspectives rather than broader perspectives.
So how does the concept of regeneration play into all of this? Can we have a regenerative economic that creates as much value as possible in all the aspects that you describe?
I think that we can create an economy that thrives. We create an economy that gives sufficient returns for capital based on the risk that it's taking. We can have an economy that is full of viable businesses that are creating a lot of social and ecological benefits. We can have an economy where it's a real diversity of enterprise structures and enterprise designs and ownership models and governance models, etc. And we can create an economy with very different sizes and scales of business as well, where some solutions scale out rather than scale up. They scale through replication. Some solutions stay very local, and others, put their intellectual property into the Creative Commons, and others replicate it elsewhere. I think it's going to be a very different kind of economy than one that is like a winner take all, hyper competitive, global, acquisition focused, very hyper competitive financial and capital markets driving every decision, very ruthlessly taking out, pulling back investment, very ruthlessly negotiating for maximum leverage over businesses and entrepreneurs. I think we're going to need to move away from some of that and into something that has a different objective in mind, not capital accumulation, but capital accumulation becomes the byproduct. But that's not the drive at the driving seat. And there's been a lot spoken about this. There's lots of purpose washing and people writing wordsmithing lovely purpose statements on things, and it's not really the point. The point is that we need to completely redesign to genuinely change the power and priority given to finance in the economic system. Finance is like a lubricant. It oils the machine. It's not the end goal. You don't use it to maximize the extraction. It's like, if you have a bicycle wheel and you put some oil on it to keep things flowing. You don't then go, how do we design this bicycle wheel so that it drips the maximum amount of oil back into a container? The function of the oil is to serve the market. The market is there to serve society, and society is there to live within the boundaries of the ecological system and this living planet. So we need to and we reverse that. Everything is in service. Like the planet's in service to society, society's in service to the economy is in service to maximum capital accumulation. And there's something that is incredibly limiting about this. It can drive some solutions that meet those parameters, but it limits many solutions that fail to meet those parameters.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds very similar to the concept of degrowth, which we covered in a previous episode. So essentially a critique to this race to grow profits at all costs, is essentially, which doesn't really serve anyone. Do you see any differences in the system that you see we need to move to, and what degrowth proponents suggest?
I think we share a lot of similar analysis. I think there are different terms that different people use to describe it, and also, by the way, in some languages these terms work quite differently as well. They have different implications and connotations. So I try not to get hung up on the language, instead focus on the destination. And I think nearly everyone I've met who is working as part of the degrowth movement, one of our sister movements, is completely in agreement with the objectives that we're talking about here. And yeah, I think I would class all of us as part of a post-growth movement that is saying, look, growth is not the objective anymore. Growth was a bit of a distracting and damaging and extractive goal for a while, and it has placed severe limitations on what loads of society can do. And the bit that matters, and I work on the most, that matters to me because of my work, is on business. This focus on growth and the optimization and the increased focus on that optimization on returns to capital that's happened from 100 years ago. Companies weren't hyper financialized in this way. It's happened on our watch. It's happened in the last 50, 60 years, the way that private equity has taken over huge parts of industries and said, look, we're here now to drive down costs and increase the value to sell this back out in 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. Venture capital was not the dominant model for startups. That's actually 30 years ago, before the dot-com boom and Silicon Valley. Prior to that being such a big part of our economy, you didn't think about entrepreneurship and startups through this perspective of you have to have 10x, 20x, 30x growth, that you have to be a unicorn that maximizes huge exits for your investors, and everything that fails to meet that, unless you're on your way to be $1 billion company, you're a failure. So we're going to destroy you by pushing you to grow so hard. That wasn't normal. These are all very recent things that have crept under us and have created a bit of a myth. And in the startup world, 99% of businesses and startups are not a fit for venture capital. Yet it is the dominant concept, the dominant theory that shapes the way entrepreneurship is happening, the way startups are emerging. So yeah, I find it really critical for us to to take a step back and realize, whoa, this hyper-financialized model that has crept into the world of business and markets is a recent phenomenon, and is just created an increased obsession with growth of capital and growth of accumulation of capital.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a bit wild how obsessed we are with unicorns. For example, in Italy, our economy is not exactly the most thriving in Europe. We've had lots of problems, but there's always those articles saying, "Oh, we have X number of unicorns now," and it's like, okay, but loads of people are miserable. Like, I don't know. Maybe let's try on focusing on growing the economy in a different way. But I suppose that, the Silicon Valley model that's somewhat captured everyone's attention at the global level. Um, but so talking about, definitions, I asked you about degrowth, and it's great to see that in the end of the day, more or less everyone in these movements wants the same thing, which is a change. So can you describe what Doughnut Economics means? And you can use your mug now.
I can use my mug now. And by the way, this is the first time I think I've waited, 30 minutes to talk about the donut. It's I've been doing this role for
personal
3.5 years.
record.
It's a
Okay.
personal record. So thank you for facilitating that. We mentioned the donut. We mentioned Doughnut Economics at the beginning, and I'm guessing a part of your, listeners are saying, well, why are we talking about pastry? Like, what has that got to do with with anything? Well, I'm going to lift up my mug to give you a sense. So the donut is this. On the outside is the planetary boundaries. These are the 9 planetary boundaries that Earth system scientists have told us that we cannot transgress. This includes biodiversity loss, ocean acidification. It includes, of course, climate change, a whole bunch of things that we have to stay within the limits of the planet. We can quantify these. We know roughly where we are globally and nationally on these boundaries. On the inside are the social foundations. So this is the essentials of life. So our economy, it can't expand outside the planet's boundaries, but nor can it go within social foundations. So it has to provide enough food and water and energy and livelihoods and housing and all the things that we need as humanity to thrive, right? So it is neither in shortfall, neither falling short on life's essentials, nor overshooting planet's boundaries. That is the donut. That is where the safe and just space for humanity is on this amazing living planet of ours. So if that's the goal, and that's the donut. Doughnut Economics is a way of getting into that. It's about reformulating that as the goal. And there are 7 ways that my colleague and friend Kate Rayworth has written about in her book. She came up with the concept of the donut and Doughnut Economics and wrote an amazing economics book, helping people to think through how to be economists that are fit for the 21st century, how to reformulate economics so that getting into the donut is the goal rather than growth for its own sake. And it includes to create to regenerate. It includes the concept of design to distribute and a whole bunch of others. And for the business world, those 2 are the central ones that we focus on. How does a business create to regenerate? So we talked about regenerative earlier. And how does it design to distribute? So design everything that it does and is to share value and opportunity much more equitably with all who co-create that value. And that suddenly takes us into the concept of what does this mean for business then? If the business is going to pursue the goals of Doughnut Economics to get humanity into the donut, then, and this is a collective endeavor, we don't have company donuts. We don't say this company is in the donut or not in the society. Humanity collectively need to get into the donut. Then they need to be able to pursue those transformative actions that we know that are essential. They need, if you're in the fashion world, you need to move away from fast fashion into more circular, slow fashion. If you're in food, we need to move away from high import intensive monocrop agriculture towards mixed methods of farming that are regenerative and organic in their approach, agroecologically approaches. For instance, if you're in energy, we know we need to move away from fossil fuels towards renewables. If you're in the built environment, we're going to need to use a lot of existing buildings and minimize the damage that we do through new constructions, for instance. So all of these transformations are needed. And the last step is, well, if we want to pursue those transformations with urgency and ambition, what is it in our enterprise design that is holding us back? And that includes looking at, by enterprise design, we mean looking at the purpose of the business, why the business exists, what are its products, services, the networks of the business. So all those relationships with all the different kinds of stakeholders, including in its supply chain and with its peers, with its consumers, its community, with its government. Thirdly, its governance model. So what is it about the way it's governed to be in service of that purpose and not just in service to finance? Its ownership design, how its ownership itself can enable or hold back these ambitions. And lastly, its relationship with finance. So what are the financial parameters of exits and dividend expectations and share price growth, margins and internal reinvestment models that enable or hold back the business from being able to pursue these actions and these models. So it's those 5 layers of enterprise design that we need to reformulate to enable businesses to take the actions necessary that help them to get humanity into the donut.
How can companies do this? Are there any resources out there? Is it something that you do? You help companies with this? Because it sounds like a really big undertaking.
Yeah, so we've created tools that any business can use that allow them to ask these questions, these heuristic questions about the transformations they'll need to undergo. It's a guided methodology for them to run an internal workshop for themselves. If they go to doughuneconomics.org and they go to the themes dropdown and go to business and enterprise, they'll find all the information they need. It requires someone to facilitate it internally, so someone will need to prepare. And there is some guidance and rules around how to do this with integrity as well, to make sure that we're not coming out there saying this is a donut company and this is not. We don't. It's not. This is not an assessment framework. This is not. This is a heuristic journey to ask questions about what are the deep elements of redesign that are needed for this company to belong to a 21st century economy. We also have a community of practitioners. I think we had 112 at last count, organizations that are registered as practitioners of Doughnut Economics with businesses. So any business and any business network can go and engage with these individuals who are registered to use these tools with clients. People are running workshops with lots of businesses, like local business communities, chambers of commerce. Impact hubs are registered and they're running these sessions. Organizations like the Specialty Coffee Association and others are running it. So there's a huge sort of range of business networks, business communities, business organizations, consultancies that are values aligned, that are registered on our organization at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, that are there ready to use these tools. And we support them. I run webinars and training sessions and create new materials and sometimes run test and pilot workshops with businesses to keep improving these methodologies.
Is there an interest? Do you find a growing interest from the corporate world?
There is. So there's a lot of interest in the donut. There's interest in donut economics, and there are lots of individuals who are interested in enterprise design because they realize that ultimately we can talk about all these things, but we are sitting in structures that need to evolve. We're sitting in structures that can evolve. That can look at ideas like putting nature on the board. Can nature be represented in the board and the governance of the business? Ideas like steward ownership, which are saying, look, the business isn't here to be sold in the long term. The business is owned by itself. It's got investors that it pays a return to, but they're not the ones that are controlling. The external investors are not the ones that are controlling what the business does. And these models of steward ownership are emerging. Models like post-growth entrepreneurship are emerging. Employee ownership models that are hybrids and 20, 30, 40% of the business owned by employees or communities that are emerging. There's lots of interesting cooperative models, platform cooperatives and others that are emerging, social enterprise structures. There are huge guardian share structures and mission locks and asset locks. And I know these are like new terms I'm sprinkling in, but just to give you a sense that there's some really interesting innovations happening across the corporate and business world and the entrepreneurship ecosystem as well. So all sort of sizes and maturities of businesses. And I'm excited by that. I also am sometimes daunted by that because there's a huge amount of innovation needed, and the mainstream financial markets are a bit slow in coming to this party of how do we redesign companies so they can do what we need them to do, not just ask them to do it and measure it differently, but actually be structured to take the actions and investments and practices needed to unlock these transitions that are essential and urgent.
What do you think of nature targets? That's a sort of recent trend that companies set targets to limit their impact on nature. So, for example, they analyze water pollution, air pollution, deforestation, etc. And for those listeners who may not familiar, is something similar to climate targets about reducing emissions as much as possible. Obviously, this is sort of much broader because nature is so much more than emissions. So do you think that's something that can help? Because you also mentioned the concept of just going beyond no harm. But it seems that some investors are convinced, they approve this trend of setting nature impacts.
I mean, I think these are essential and these are really helpful. They need to happen alongside transformations in the design of the company, because we've also seen a lot of companies, set targets, set goals, and not take the necessary action to then address their core business model, their manufacturing processes, their impacts, and the heart of what they are. So we need the targets to set ambition. We need the transformation of enterprise design to enable companies to take the action needed as well, alongside regulatory change, alongside, cooperation and collaboration across sectors. There's a whole host of things that need to happen. So, I mean, there's a lot of methodological debates and arguments about nature-based targets and science-based targets. For instance, we don't get into those. Those have got some very valid critiques as well as some very valid reasonings for why they've evolved in the way that they have. But ultimately, we need targets to give a sense of direction for companies, and we need a transformation in the design of companies in order to enable them to take the action needed.
Going back to something that you mentioned at the very beginning, which is the social benefits of a regenerative economy. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, the social benefits, firstly, we are humans living on a planet that needs to survive and needs to be conducive to life. So just the species that require a balanced ecosystem around them, that require, a stable climate, that require soils that are functioning and can grow food over the decades to come, that want to see minimum amount of natural disasters and disruptions, that need healthy forests for lots of inventions, for medicinal, evolution, for all sorts of research and development. Like, for all these reasons, we need to live with and within the cycles of the living world, right? So just as a human species. In addition, the current economic model of things can only happen if they maximize accumulation of capital is limiting in terms of social benefits as well. So if we can create organizational forms that are able to pursue the kind of social and ecological goals we're talking about, then we can also unlock the action needed that can create much more equitable solutions too. So we can also create models that, nature is represented on the boards, but workers are represented too. That there's an internal reinvestment model for ecological transition, but there's also an internal reinvestment model to enable far better wages and livelihoods and better conditions for workers and communities. The same if we can find models of enterprise design that can avoid environmentally destructive impacts, we can also evolve enterprise design to make sure we don't have destructive impacts on human health, for instance, through products that are sold. So the journeys are parallel. And ultimately, if we solve the ecological crisis by creating, circular palaces that no one can afford, and we create huge destruction of work and livelihoods in manufacturing, if we don't bring communities along and create social benefits alongside it, then there is no ecological transition. It doesn't happen. It gets blocked anyway. So the two go hand in hand. We can't just move to technical ecological solutions that aren't creating benefits for society. Society won't accept them. It'll reject them. There'll be political instability, social instability. There'll be all sorts of crises. So the two are hand in hand. You have to design an economy that is both ecologically regenerative and socially distributive. And you can't just get to avoid one, create incredibly good technical solutions to one without the other.
Yeah, I suppose, as you said, people are not going to get on board with that plan. Thank you so much, Arinj. I don't really have any questions at the moment. Is there anything else that we really should have covered?
No, I mean, the only thing I would end by saying, Julia, is that if you're a business person in this direction, that's interested in this direction of travel for the economy, then have a look at doughuteconomics.org and our resources. But also have a look at the diverse range of solutions happening in your sector, that are happening in your geography, your local business communities, social enterprise networks, various sort of sustainable business communities that have emerged around the world. And have a look at the organizational design as well. Look at the structure, look at the ownership model, the governance model. How can it evolve over time? We've got some case studies that we've released on ways some businesses have evolved their own enterprise design over the years. So this is possible. It's also essential. Without changing enterprise design, a lot of the solutions are going to be held back.
We will add all the links as well in the show notes. Thank you so much again, and thank you to our listeners for following us. We will be back next week, but before that, check out our social media and why not subscribe to our newsletter. See you next week.